Hey guys, coming back at you from Therapy Rocks, and we are talking again today about spontaneous age regression. Okay, it's a form of flashback. It's a form of emotional flashback that most trauma survivors struggle with on a regular basis. In fact, I think it is probably one of the biggest issues with complex PTSD, childhood trauma, childhood relational trauma, developmental trauma, disorders of extreme stress, not otherwise specified. A lot of these terms are not listed in the DSM-5, but they are well studied and well known with, in the field of trauma treatment for those that are, treating a lot of childhood trauma. So the concept of the emotional flashback is one of, again, the most torturous things that trauma survivors have to deal with, because it really affects their ability to function in the world and function in relationships. And we all know that relationships are necessary in order for us to heal. So we have covered, what is spontaneous age regression. You can look at previous videos for that. We've covered parts, emotional parts. We've covered most grown-up part. We've covered the concept of the apparently normal part, which is also called the most grown-up part or the self, depending on what language we're using. We've talked about that in previous videos. So now basically we have the concept of spontaneous age regression. We have the concept of someone walking along in their everyday life as a very well-accomplished, high-functioning individual, potentially, sometimes. The example I'm going to use talks about that. So we have somebody walking along in their everyday life, they're doing well at work, but when they go home, their emotional parts are a lot more present, and sometimes those emotional parts get more easily activated or triggered by things that happen in relationships. So a person can feel very good about their work life, but feel very lousy about their relational life. And that's a problem, for most trauma survivors. So we've talked about the wounded child part. That's a part that people often regress to. People develop wounded child parts because a lot of their trauma happened during those years and during those stages of development. We've talked about the adolescent part. And again, that's when survivors, it's a common regression for trauma survivors, because typically people who grow up in dysfunctional family systems also have a lousy adolescent life for lots of reasons. And then we talked about the internalized perpetrator part. All of the parts have an attachment to the perpetrator, but this internalized perpetrator part is a special entity called, sometimes called the inner critic. It's the part that administers constant doses of toxic shame to people. It's the part that has a real tough time giving anyone else grace, giving themselves grace. It's the part that's it's that inner critic, that part that constantly monitors everything you do and criticizes everything you do. And it just really gets in the way of healing, because it keeps all of the parts afraid, and it keeps all of the parts hyper aroused. The neuroscience behind this is just incredible if you get a chance to study it. I'll give you some resources for that. But, when you are hyper aroused all the time, you are in survival mode all the time, you really aren't present in life. You're really reliving your trauma every single moment and every single day, which is really sad. And also not good for your body and not good for your psyche. So we don't want to be doing that. We don't want to be functioning in survival mode. We want to be in our window of tolerance. We want to be helping those child parts recognize that it's safe now. It's safe to come out. It's safe to be present. They don't have to hide anymore. They don't have to be afraid. And we have to make sure we put ourselves in situations where we don't get re-traumatized, so that those parts really learn to trust us and really learn to, like I said, be more present, and with the final goal of integration, and wholeness, and this is for all childhood trauma survivors. We talk a little bit at the end of every video to people who are Christian specifically, but this applies to everyone. Everyone is looking for wholeness, looking for maturity, looking to be able to grow up and function in the adult world in a way that they can be proud of some of the fruit that they have grown. And so we really want to crush this issue. We want to crush it. We want to understand it. We want to be able to manage it. We want to be able to work towards integration and get that out of the way. So we really have to understand that there may be an internalized perpetrator part that we really need to work with. We need to help that part understand that the ding dong, the witch is dead. The war is over. There is no perpetrator that's standing waiting to lash out at us or shame us, so that part can just relax and let go and stop shaming those child parts that are in our psyche. So what we're going to do, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. I'll try to explain them again. If you get a copy of this book, if you want one, let me know. It might be a little easier for you to understand the pictures that I've grown. And this is, the language I use 3 different languages for phase 1 work. And the one that I wrote this book on is mostly ego state therapy. And so again, we talk about, an adult part, most grown-up part, apparently normal part. And then we talk about the concept of being activated or triggered and getting little. That sudden regression that people experience that takes them into that child part or that adolescent part or that internalized perpetrator part. This is the concept of spontaneous age regression, or what we call getting little. Okay, so we have these parts here, but we have this internalized perpetrator part. See how it's big? And see how it touches and overlaps these parts, because it influences these parts. Okay, and anybody who has an internalized perpetrator part also has an invisible but very real attachment to the perpetrator. So we want to be able to recognize the work of the internalized perpetrator part, recognize that there is a trauma bond with an actual perpetrator that needs to be broken. And so there's different ways of breaking these trauma bonds, but it starts with awareness. So as a person heals, they eventually will get to the point where you'll start to see, this is one of the photos that are later on, you'll start to see that attachment to the perpetrator is breaking. Okay, and that adolescent part is bigger, the child part's bigger, and that little round red circle is a lot smaller. The trauma bond, here's the perpetrator over here, and here's the child that's attached, the part that's attached to the perpetrator. That trauma bond is breaking. And when that trauma bond breaks, all the parts feel a lot freer, and they are freed up for integration. And so what it looks like, this is again my picture, my diagram. This is what it looks like when all the parts are integrated. We aren't doing away with any part. We're trying to get all the parts integrated and working together better, so that one part is not getting triggered, acting out, overreacting, underreacting, and causing more problems in relationships and potentially at work and socially also. So that's what it looks like to stay big. Yay. Her relief, you can see the relief on her face. The trauma bond is broken. She's so happy. And believe me, then you are freed up to have healthy relationships with family, friends, and God. The trauma bond is broken. Healthy attachments versus attachment to the perpetrator. That's what it looks like. And that internalized perpetrator part is also transformed and integrated. That's that rainbow looking circle. So again, all the parts have a positive intention, and we want all the parts to be integrated. So that's the whole, I guess, concept of, again, recognizing that you're having spontaneous age regression, that you're having emotional flashbacks that are triggered, finding out what those triggers are, listing what those triggers are, working with your therapist or your support people so that you can try to avoid some of those triggers initially. Obviously we can't avoid triggers forever. And as we get better at managing those emotional flashbacks, then, we're not going to be so worried about avoiding situations that trigger them. But there are some obvious things that we can avoid. If you raise your awareness around your triggers, you're going to see that, there's times that you get dysregulated and you're not sure why, but wow, all of a sudden I'm noticing that I get dysregulated every time I sit down and I watch the X-Files, or every time I watch, something where there's a sexual abuse scene or a rape scene. Those are some obvious things that we can avoid. Also, being in dysfunctional relationships can really be a trigger, for trauma survivors. Job situations nowadays are just so, I don't know, there's so many toxic work environments nowadays that oftentimes trauma survivors are getting triggered at work also. So there's really no safe place. They're getting activated at work, and then they go home and they have these dysfunctional relationships with their husbands or boyfriends, and then they're activated all the time, and they don't recognize it. And so they get caught up in, behaviors that help them try to bind some of that anxiety, and that's not usually good. So you can see how this can snowball, but we need to stop it and gain that awareness and start to learn how to manage these episodes of spontaneous age regression much better, so that our relationships can heal and grow. So that's it for that. I do want to cover, I want to start to cover one of the appendixes, some of the behaviors of complex PTSD. I probably should have done this at the beginning, but it's in this particular book, it's at the end in one of the appendixes, and I'm just going to talk about two of them today. All or nothing thinking and behaving. And these are characteristics that you may see in your own life, symptoms that you may see in your own life. And again, be real careful not to shame yourself if you see yourself here. Of course you're having these symptoms. Given where you come from, we would expect that. So this is just to raise your awareness, again, so that you can, keep that in mind when you're in relationship. All or nothing thinking and behaving. So basically what that means is you're thinking with your limbic brain instead of your prefrontal cortex. So all or nothing, everything's black or white. Everything's all good or all bad. Your new teacher, your therapist, your preacher was all good. He was fantastic. He was wonderful. He's up on a pedestal and he makes one mistake and, then he becomes all bad. Okay. It's a childlike way of thinking, and it comes from the limbic brain. The limbic brain functions in the all or nothing. Something's either all good or all bad. It's very primitive, and there is not the ability to integrate good and bad. I'm here to tell you there is good and bad. There are good and bad qualities in all of us. We all have good and bad parts. Okay? So no one is all good or all bad. When you catch yourself idealizing people, putting them on pedestals, be very, very careful. Be very, very careful. The child parts want to do that. The child parts want to plug into somebody because remember, they're still looking for mommy and daddy. They're still looking to get their dependency needs met. They've still got open sticky tape, I call it, where they're looking to put someone in here because they weren't able to. So you've got to recognize that and not put people on pedestals. Everyone is human. We all make mistakes. The all or nothing thinking and behavior can really get in the way of you having successful relationships with healthy people. So be on the lookout for that. Compulsive behaviors and addictions is the next one, the last one we'll do. Compulsive behaviors and addictions. Again, this comes out of the survivor's attempt to manage the pain, manage the dysregulation. Manage the emotional flashbacks, manage the triggers. If you're being activated all the time, you're gonna look for some relief. And when you're a kid, there's not a whole lot to grab a hold of. I tell people all the time, what do you have when you're a kid to try to soothe yourself? You've got your thumb, you can suck on your thumb, you can masturbate, as a kid to try to distract yourself. You can eat if you have access to food. You can organize and clean things if you're old enough. And then when you get to a certain age, you can grab a hold of alcohol, drugs, compulsive sexual behavior, compulsive shopping. All those things will distract from the pain that those child parts are really feeling and carrying. All those memories, that trauma that those parts are carrying. So no surprise that most people who struggle with addiction also have histories of childhood trauma. So again, give yourself grace for that. You found a way to survive. You used the tools that you had, and that was a really creative solution at the time. So we'll talk a little bit next time about present time orienting your parts, which is a big word for just bringing them into 2022, helping them recognize that ding dong, the witch is dead. And it's a process, folks. It's something you have to do all the time, every day, and it has to be a continuous process. As you walk through a healing process that you are committed to. We talked about that last time, really making a commitment, but taking your time and recognizing this is a process, and don't push so hard that you are outside your window of tolerance, okay, where you're actually causing dysregulation for yourself. So that's it for today. If you like what you're hearing, give a thumbs up and subscribe. And until next week, I'll be praying that you all are managing your activation and that you're able to stay big, or that you have the support you need when you get activated. And again, I want to remind you, I get it. I know what it feels like. And I understand the process of walking through this is not easy. So God bless and take care.